Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Now, today's going to be one of those episodes where if you're a newcomer, you may not listen to this episode at all. If you've been with the show for a long time, you know that there's a reason for these episodes, and they're important. This is a particular topic that I have had over the last 3 years come to me, and it's like, oh my God, this has to be done. I mean, I have to do this episode. And then I can't remember exactly how I would, put all the facts together such that the feeling I'm having inside myself, which is one of great importance, could be conveyed to you guys. Because part of it just seems utterly wrong. On this show I always say to you that if you're thinking a thought of truth, you have this kind of cool, clean feeling going through your body. But when you think of something that is just wrong, we are built out of truth, because if we weren't, our algorithms would not work, and if we didn't work, we wouldn't exist, right? So the very fact that you're held together by the universe means that you are built out of perfectness. Why do we get sick? Because we negate the way that the world was balanced back in the day. We allow big giant companies to replace our food supplies. We allow ourselves to get hooked on a bunch of things that marketing firms say are important. And we infect our bodies, we infect our minds, we infect our souls. And then we either die early or we die with concerns that we have perhaps compromised our very integrity with the universe. And the process by which this occurs is called trends. And, when you look back probably the last 100 years, if you go back 100 years to today, you're going to see this hockey stick, line graph, where we barely had any trends, and now it is an absolute de facto thing. Trends, 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 trends. Every single aspect of your life is supposed to be a trend, according to the marketing firms of today, right? This can be interesting, but can also be extremely damaging. And obviously, where it's interesting, we should pay attention, but where it's damaging, we got to be careful. So how did trends start? Well, I doubt anyone really knows the very first trend that occurred. But I think in the modern age, the average definition for the last 100 years would be something serendipitous happened for a company by which society itself created a trend. And someone made a shit ton of money off of it. And it probably came and went several times without anyone really trying to manhandle the algorithm. They just say, oh, that was so wild. Remember 10 years ago this happened and this thing got really popular? Those shoes, that dress, this hairdo. Everyone who provided those services made out like a bandit. And as long as the world is actually fairly balanced and a single income household could pay for everything that you need, maybe you don't pay attention because the need to make a bunch of money isn't there. But when you're a company and the market in which you deal, this isn't all going to be marketing necessarily. The theme of this show is to rebuild society from the ground up. And this is probably one of the most important problems, psychoses, addictions that we have as a full-blown world society. But I will tell you that this exact mechanism, trends, is probably one of the most life-threatening things to the culture of your country and your people. Regardless if you're a bag of a bunch of different races or you're predominantly one race, doesn't even matter. But we're going to get into it all. But the companies that needed cash because the market they're in became very saturated can use trends to survive. Now, a quick example would be, it's 1915. It's Kansas City, Kansas. There's a couple dressmakers in town. So there's plenty of people that want dresses, right? Very few dressmakers. There's one on the western Kansas City side, Kansas side, one on the eastern Missouri side, right? But people start noticing, hey, there's a lot of money to be made making dresses, and so 4 or 5 others come up over the next decade. All right, now, the demand's going down. The amount of money these individuals make are going down. but everything's still balanced. And then 10 more show up. Imports start showing up from New York and LA. Now people are starting to struggle. So now the competition is to innovate new dresses that no one else has, and so they can create a trend. Maybe someone even accidentally does one. Resurrects an old dress or brings in a new one. You get my point. But a crap ton of dresses are bought from one company, and only one company. Perhaps they have patent protection. Perhaps they just honor designs. Maybe they can't even copy the dress because there's some ingredient and some skill set that doesn't exist in the other dress manufacturers. So everyone sees the power of the trend. They see it from the consumer side, and they also see it from the manufacturing side. Well, 50 years goes by and say that particular company's really good at that thing. They can make trends. They can make the new dresses. They always seem to have the one that everyone wants, and everyone else is trying to copy the one they did 10 years ago. So you fast forward 50 years, and that company that has all the, trendy stuff, well, their building is like 10 stories higher than all the other buildings of their competitors because they can afford it. Their staff is much better paid. They're famous. They start exporting around the world because they have that trendy dress from Kansas. All right. So that's sort of how it could serendipitously start. Once that algorithm gets in the mind of corporations, then they can strive for it. And they use the most conspiratorial group of folks on planet Earth called marketing firms to instill two things. One, to take whatever's on deck and start demonizing it. You don't want to listen to that old music. You don't want to wear those old dresses. Hey, we're not wearing brown anymore, right? I mean, you may laugh, but that's, you've been through those cycles yourself. And so they need to find, obviously, prior to the demonization of what exists on deck, they will simply find something new. They won't find something better. They will find something new. And then you have to adopt the new thing, demonize the old thing, so you can feel trendy, up to date. But now, how does that work? How do you convince a human being to dislike what they've been liking for, say, perhaps 10 years? Now, when I was a kid, we loved the 70s and loved the 80s all at the same time. It was interesting. But by the 90s, boy, you got a huge switch. You had to hate the 80s, other than Lenny Kravitz keeping the 70s alive. You hated everything before the stuff you were listening to. But there's a substrate to our brains that's very, very important when it comes to trends. And it has to do with your perception of aging. And hopefully this year I'm going to do an episode with an acquaintance of mine who is pioneering some really good thought processes on this. But if you start to fear your age, and I travel quite a bit these days, and I see it in airports a lot. People that are 10, 20 years beyond their younger days, but they are wearing clothing that is sort of doesn't work. I mean, more power to them if they want to, but they're just sucking the teat of trends. Women that are trying to look like they're 20 years old when they're in their 60s. Their bodies can't fill out the old yoga pants quite like the granddaughter can, right? The old guys that are dyeing their hair. But they can't keep up with it, so they have lots of gray popping through constantly, right? What a pain in the ass. Was it Lou Dobbs on Fox now? He was gray for about 10, 15 years, and all of a sudden he shows up with brown hair. We're like, Lou, man, nobody needs your hair to be a youthful color necessarily speaking. But he also went for like this really weird sour brown instead of like maybe go blonde, dude, because like you were really lightheaded, light-haired. It's like if I showed up with black hair on this show, you'd know it would be Halloween, right? Oh, there's an idea. Little digression. One of the things we used to do in the game business and software in general is that you would do something cosmetically to your body that you didn't want to keep. And it made you want to, but the rule was that you'd have to finish your project before you could actually change this cosmetic thing about you. Some folks used to grow beards, and they hate beards, and so the beard gets long and gross, and the only way they can cut it off in their brain is to finish their project and get it bug-free. I used to dye my hair black, which I made it work a couple times, but I was always eager to get back to my normal color, which was platinum way back in the 90s. But now, what are some of the benefits of trends before I go for the negative? In technology, it's very, very interesting. Unlike the perhaps unnecessary need to change the way that clothing is cut up and made, okay? And with corporations, the optimization of clothing and products in general is see how cheap you can make it. What kind of crappy materials can you make something out of? Now, someone might say, well, we're trying to figure out what cheaper materials we can make it out of that are actually as strong as the stronger materials, but I think that's very few and far between. Again, people still own appliances from the 30s because they still work, because they're made out of like tank metal, And today, if you buy a coffee maker, it's $15 for a coffee maker. It weighs about 3 ounces, and it's made of the cheapest plastic on planet Earth, and it just happens to be a device that is routinely associated with burning your house down. Really sad, right? But let's just go for computers. Trends in computers have been probably one of the most phenomenal benefits we've ever had. Now, it gets kind of silly. There was a great SNL skit with, I believe, Will Ferrell, where they were talking about the new... In fact, there's a couple different skits on this, but it was Apple constantly trying to make something thinner and smaller. And I forgot which comedian did it, but I believe he did it on the news, where he kept opening up a smaller and smaller phone. He was impersonating Steve Jobs. It was really funny. But for those of you who are familiar with the history of computers, you know that they used to fill entire warehouses. And they had, there's no device made today that is as weak as the computers that we used to fill up warehouses with. Your average calculator, the cheapest calculator you could possibly buy, could probably outperform the warehouse computers today, right? But now, today we have cell phones that could eclipse the Cray computers of the early 80s. And for those of you who don't know what that is, you can look it up. I think it's CRAY. And Cray was a brilliant engineer that figured out that if he stacked chips right next to each other, that he could cut down on a lot of the microseconds that are consumed by sending data across a bus line over a printed circuit board. And so he literally took chips and he said, you've seen a chip before, those little legs on them, right? So instead of connecting the chip to a PCB board and then making it go across one of those lines over to another chip, he simply put the legs into the other leg of the next chip, making it hopscotch through chips so that he could send data faster. And it was they were beautiful computers, but I heard that they are really cheap. Like they would fall apart if you bumped into them physically. But they used those computers to render the first computer-generated movie, Tron, in 1982. Now, the Visual Effects Society in Los Angeles, I believe about 10 years ago, took a iPhone 4S and then calculated how quickly they could render the movie Tron on one of these telephones, right? It took months and months and months on the Cray computers and a few others, like 3 or 4 other computers that were being used at the time. But I think it was... The phone was 1,000 times more powerful than the most powerful computer of that time, and they could render the whole movie in about 15 minutes on a phone, on an iPhone 4. Now think about it. We went from warehouses to little tiny calculators, and then we souped up the gigahertz, to megahertz, then gigahertz, and now we have multiple processors and tons of memory and super fast storage facilities. Inside our computers. We have wireless network. We finally have Tesla's invention. We went from big giant resistors to little tiny micro resistors. We went from big giant tubes to printed circuit boards to ASIC chips with from a couple resistors on a circuit board to billions and trillions of resistors in your average processor. Miniaturized. That's driven by trends. Because there is a trend to buy the next fastest computer. More memory, more power. The game's got to look better. Your 3D rendering is going to render faster. Trend, trend, trend. So in that case, we actually have an interesting sort of subliminal push on the scientific side. And I think that's something that we should probably hang on to when it comes to trends. But perhaps there's a different wing of thought when it comes to that sort of trend. So what trends are bad? Could there really be a bad trend? Am I simply being a subjective narrator? Perhaps. There is the old No Country for Old Men, right? Everything changes so much from your youth that you feel like your country has essentially turned against you, I think is the way that it's sort of defined. But now, what is culture? What is a cultural trend? It's interesting when you look at cultural trends, typically you are referencing something that is older than the average 10-year trends that we have today, right? The way that the world works, according to my observations of the last 30, 40 years, is that the trends are cycled in 10-year increments, and it's always mapped to the decade that you're in. So right when the decade turns from like at 2020, you can expect the new trends to be debuted. And it takes about 2 or 3 years to figure out where the hooks are, how the society is responding to the trends. These are marketing firms that are looking at this. And then, 2030, we're going to get into another trend. But let's think about culture. If I said Germans, Mexicans, Norwegians, Egyptians, and then I say the word culture, most of us with, just a basic knowledge of those areas of the world where these races exist, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Russians, you seldom think of a 10-year trend. Right? You don't sit there and go, oh, Mexico, oh yeah, the really long-toed boots that are really popular down there right now. No, you think of the whole lineage of the Mexican race and the food and the culture that's down there. When you go to visit, you're not really looking for the latest trend in Mexico. You're looking for the entire gamut of what they are, right? Germany, lederhosen. Right? Do you think that just invented in one decade and then it just became this thing that people wear to signify traditional German culture? No. It took a really long time to develop that. Classical music. It's a culture of music unto itself. But how many hundreds of years did it stay unchanged? Most people don't realize this, but Bach was 100 years before Mozart. But in our brains, we hear them all together in school and we think it all goes together. I used to think Beethoven was before Bach because he's so chunky in his writing style, right? No, he was after Mozart, man. So what holds a particular society together? I think culture. I think it holds you together and it establishes principles by which your country and your people operate. And there's a little bit of competition, I think, between countries to prove that their culture is more developed, that their people are more principled, intelligent, kind, and caring in most cases, right? When you watch old F1 racing back in the day, you had the Italian cars going against the French cars, going against the Norwegian cars, against the American cars or the British cars. And the car was the byproduct of all the sum of engineering and education that you could get out of those countries. On top of that, they tried to make them look sexy. Of course, now everything's standardized. But it was interesting. The benefits to the people, the pride and the care. And once you saw some Italian car drive up and your car is damn good, but it's not as refined as the Italian car, guess what happens? You go home to your culture and you go, those Italians, they polish shit way more than we do. Some guy might come in from the mechanic side of things and he goes, yeah, but their gearboxes are shit. We've got that worked out. So, hey, cosmetic team, refinement team, you need to up your game. We'll continue making the best engines. And of course, the inverse conversation might be going on in Italy. But what fuels a good trend? a good culture. Those are two different things, but what I just told you in the F1 racing example, and I apologize, ladies, if that bores the hell out of you, just think fancy cars racing each other, is that combines intelligence and art together. It is a reflection of your country's or region's educational prowess, and it also talks and speaks to the artistic refinement of the right brain. Now, I'm probably going to touch on the Pyramid Code, which is an old documentary that was on YouTube, which has now been refreshed for Netflix, because it relates to culture, and it relates to trends, and it relates to the lineage of a people that basically developed their religion, their methodology, their mathematics, their science, and their culture over thousands and thousands of years, holding on to everything that they had built up over time. One of the things that they believed in heavily, the Egyptians, which is only recently being documented, because I will tell you, until the 21st century, our knowledge of Egypt is almost categorically 100% wrong. And I mean every single aspect of it, including the translations of the hieroglyphs without the acronym boost to the interpolation of what they're saying. But they believe that the woman was born with an all-powerful right brain, and the male was born with an all-powerful left brain. And over the course of their life, one is supposed to teach the other their hemisphere of thought, and full enlightenment was having both sides of their brain functioning perfectly. Why mention that? I want to start getting your brain thinking that trends need to be built out of a minimum set of components. Meaning it needs more than just a new color on your t-shirt. It needs more than just a new sort of way to bend metal in the next car that you buy. I think a trend in all circumstances should be a literal upgrade, such that if you walked into a court of law and had to prove that you should be into this trend, that you should be selling your clothing and all of your possessions so you can replace them with the next iteration of the next trend. And I'm being a little facetious here, but what if you had to walk into a court of law and prove that your new trend was an improvement over the previous trend? You had to prove it. You had to prove it in some metric of either left brain or right brain discipline. Maybe you, for an example, are wearing jeans, let's say in the mid-1800s, and you want to move up to Levi's, which started using rivets to hold the jeans together, and you went into a court of law and you said, look, I want to move up to Levi jeans because I'm a minor, and I noticed that as I bump things and stretch and twist my clothing, they tend to fall apart. But I took a rivet gun and I riveted a couple loose ends together, and my God, if they didn't just hold together, great. So it's not just simply to put rivets on my clothing, it's to hold my clothing together better. And the judge swings a gavel, boom, you're ready to go. Approved. Someone who's worshiping Bach just before Mozart takes off, and he comes in, he wants to pitch Mozart, and he says, look, I really like Bach, but he's very mathematical. I think most of us know how to play music now. We know the structure of music, which is one of the big trends of the way that Bach wrote, was to teach his kids how to play. But I want to get into the emotional spirit. And I've got this new way of writing music, or Mozart's got this new way of writing music whereby every instrument is like an animal in the forest, and it's this instrument here is literally the heartstrings of my lover, of my own despair. I want to have this, beautiful array of palette to paint emotions into the mind of man. And they approve it because this is an upgrade. Now let's look at today. For those of you who haven't discovered the rapper Hopsin, Hopsin, he is I would say the second tier of Hopsin, which is where he's really become extremely popular. He is, and I haven't seen everything he's ever done, so I can't vouch for every word he's ever spoken, but lately, the last 2 to 3 years, he has been just a beautiful philosopher of our time. And he's funny, and he's intelligent, But he has a song that just came out. Well, I just saw it for the first time. It's called No Words. And it's about 2 minutes long. His complaint about hip hop is that he got in because he wanted to be a rapper, and he copied all of the acidic formulas of rap in the 90s, drugs, sex, degrading of women and all this other kind of stuff. And then he finally woke up and said, I can't do this anymore. And so No Words is a funny rap he did just recently where he said, these guys are creating shit music. They're auto-tuning themselves and reverbing the auto-tunes such that they don't have to speak English. They never have to speak a word, and you'll buy it as if they're saying something profound. And of course, then he says at the end of the rap, he says, oh man, that was so hard. That was so hard to make that rap. But he makes a complete rap song. It'll be like 1 minute long of just gibberish. But then he shoots the video with all these hot women and gold-plated joints and cars and pouring champagne all over people's bodies and stuff, just exactly like all the raps that are out there. And he's trying to break the trend to say, look, we need to have some qualifications to what we do. And he's always promised that you'll always be able to understand the words of any one of his raps. He'll never talk so fast or so mumbly that you won't be able to understand what he's saying, because he goes, I got a message and I want you to hear the message. And so Hopsin is an absolute de facto upgrade moment for hip-hop in the 21st century. I mean, there's a demarcation line, and that dude poured the sand, or drew the line in the sand. So what are the other defects of it? Well, imagine that you have just acquired stuff. Let's say you're young. Let's say you got out of the house at 18. For whatever reason, you either went to college or you got off on your own. Even if you got off on your own, you're about 4 years ahead of the other kids in terms of getting your own place and getting your own furniture. But you slave for 10 years, roughly, between 20 and 30 to get your stuff. A sofa, a bed, a chair, a TV, whatever. But by the time you hit 31, some decade has rolled over in that time frame. And so now you're supposed to upgrade, because everything you got has now been deemed by a marketing firm, both in the eyes of the bullshit marketing firm that's simply trying to sell the next product, but also in your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your friends. They're supposed to look down on you now because you have the old thing. You only have a 1080p screen. You don't have a 4K screen. Now, sometimes these upgrades are upgrades. There are things that you might go, well, yeah, I waited 10 years to upgrade my TV, but then there was a distinct, again, technical improvement between 1080p and 4K. I love my movies, and I love my cell phone videos I take with my family, and I want to see them. They're filmed in 4K, so I want to see them in 4K. Maybe that makes more sense, right? But imagine someone infecting your brain to make you feel obsolete every 10 years with everything that you own. Your clothing, your shoes, your hair, everything. That can get kind of dangerous financially, right? How are you ever supposed to get ahead if you have to constantly upgrade? Constantly, right? I bought a Mitsubishi Eclipse in 1993, December. Walked onto a lot. My previous girlfriend had one. I loved it. Then we broke up, and I was like, God, I want one of those things. So I went in and I bought one. And I drove it for 15 years. At one point, I was making $200,000 a year driving a 93 Eclipse. And it was 7 or 8 years old at the time. But I drove it for 15 years. I literally drove it until the engine started locking up. But I was making tons of money. And people would see me with this car, and it looks, I kept it looking beautiful. I still have it. And they were confused. And I said, well, I understand there's really beautiful cars out there, but I bought this car because I like it. I want you to come over to my house, and I'll show you my $80,000 music studio. And when that car has already delivered me from point A to point B, which is a very short period of time traveling, because I only worked about 5 or 10 minutes from work at any point in time, so I'm only in the car every once in a while. But I spent hours and hours and hours, months and years making music offering my services to, like offering my instruments to other musicians that wanted to use them as well. I had more fun saving money and not buying into the trend of needing a new car. I even got into I almost bought the Lincoln Navigator at one point, and I started doing the math on it, and I said, I got the money. Hell, I could probably pay cash for this thing. But it's just not worth it. The amount of instruments I could get, or art supplies I could get, or computer processing power I could get to learn something new, so eclipsed the value of the car, I never got into it. I want you guys to be able to control your mind as the pressures come on and off to change and become full of trends. But now there is there's sort of an overlay to the soul theory, in that trends usually require the elapse of time to be recognized in the minds of man. And what does that mean? Well, I'm 49 years old. So I've had 4 pretty decent decades, probably, again, waking up around 7 years old, where my time is just fully linear and remember the rest of my life. So every 10 years, I've seen it. I've seen it in every industry that I've paid attention to. I've even profited probably from a change in music style or what have you. But now when you're young, you grow up into trends. You don't even know where the trend is at 10 years old. You might feel it, but it's more subconscious. I know a bunch of teenagers. They're in my neighborhood. They're my friends' kids. They listen to music that I think is complete dog shit. I mean, the worst dog shit in the world, right? If you had to go in a court of law and prove that it was music, you probably would lose your case, right? But they've grown up into the trend. It was simply there when they arrived. But as an adult, or as someone, I guess you'd be an adult, but as someone who grew up in different eras, different trends, and the fact that the art of America and the world was much higher 30, 40 years ago, we can see with our naked eye how bad the music is today, right? How auto-tuned it is, how the lyrics basically make no points whatsoever, right? Sort of the caveman algorithm of man likes girl is pretty much most of the lyrics today. So if you're looking at your kids or kids in general liking things that you don't like, and you can see the before and after degradation of that particular thing, we have to cut them a little bit of a blank check because they don't understand the algorithm whatsoever. Hopefully they do. And hopefully, since music has hit rock fucking bottom recently, the only place you can go from there is up, right? And I think that that's starting to happen. Like I say all the time on the show, I'm watching 14-year-old girls shred guitars like Yngwie Malmsteen. I mean, it's unreal where we're going. I think it's going to be a great musical era in about 10 years. We're going to be, hopefully, with our jaws on the ground as these kids start to really figure out music. But hopefully they're doing more than just mimicking old guitar solos. Hopefully there's some kids out there that are going to be lead singers that look at old lyrics and realize what metaphor is all about and talk about the struggles that they're going through and what have you, right? One of the scenarios that just turns my stomach is the notion that there would be a marketing team that comes together and they are being tasked with generating the next trend for their industry. And again, I don't have anything against them personally. They're trying to create a reason for you to buy their products, right? Apple's whole thing about face recognition and, thinness and blah, blah, blah. It's just trying to make you care about something, trying to make you feel like you need something you don't need, right? We've been making phone calls since the phone was invented. And, at no point in the 80s or 70s did anyone say, oh my God, my life would have been so much better, but I couldn't make that phone call. There was no problem. There's a payphone outside. You had a phone at your house. Big deal. Now, of course, there have been emergency situations where cell phones were very, very helpful. So, it's not a bad thing that cell phones exist. But the idea that a firm gets together, sits down and invents a trend that no one needs, especially one of those really just stupid ones, and then society just falls in place. right? Because no one is thinking for themselves on average in this world. Now, hopefully that's changing, and the Great Awakening of 2018 is playing a big role in everyone kind of going, what? Where the hell am I? What do I have on? What am I driving? What's this shit in my house? I don't need any of this crap. Again, I'll mention it several times throughout the entire show. Or I should say a season. With the movie Branded is probably one of the best examples of how this works. It's a fictional movie about aliens and a bunch of other stuff, but there is a very human aspect of the marketing side of this thing. It's about a guy he's a master marketing whiz, and he just succeeds every place he goes. He eventually retires out of it, getting disgusted with it, and then something is revealed about the human nature of addiction and lust for things. And he comes back to the industry and basically discovers that there's aliens involved with our lust patterns, and they feed off of our lust. But before this, there's a meeting where they try to convince, they basically meet with all of these corporate heads of fast food companies and what have you, and this guy says, we're going to sell the concept of being fat to the world. And this movie's at least 10 years old, maybe even more. And they ended up doing it. They sell fat to the world. And if you think about it today, God bless you if you're overweight. I understand the struggle there. But today they are trying to pitch two things at once. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. And the cognitive dissonance algorithm in the brain, again, your ability to deny something that you know is true, starts getting into that double speak thing where you can bullshit yourself. One side of your mouth's going one way and the other side's going the other way. Anyone who's ever struggled with addiction and had any awareness of their addiction, they know exactly what this is like. They know they shouldn't drink, but they drink. And maybe the liver's about to pop or something, right? But on one side of the liberal agenda of the left, they're trying to sell obesity, right? Full insanity. We're not talking about big bone girls, because they're out there and they're beautiful, and that's the way they should be. And guys are the same way, but guys don't ever get that much crap for being husky. But girls, second they don't, have the shape of being 22 years old, all of a sudden, to that degree, they are defective in the eyes of society, right? But obesity is probably one of the most well-documented reasons for being unhealthy. Severe organ strain, severe joint strain. Even those that are naturally big will sometimes develop these problems. Talk to any NBA guy over 7 feet. He has joint pains that no one else has. I mean, you might have your own joint pains. This dude has more. Ask Andre the Giant, who literally died of being gigantic. His was a growth pattern issue, right? And the flip side of the liberal left agenda, extreme left, right? Nobody should be in that fucking group. You can be left all you want, but extreme left is crazy. But the other extreme leftist agenda is veganism. You're not supposed to eat meat. You're not supposed to eat fucking anything that's healthy for you, right? And what ends up happening, and especially with the friends that I have seen go through this cycle, is that they were overweight. They were eating really badly. And they went vegan. And they went through a very important detox that needed to occur in their body. And all of a sudden, they feel amazing. They stopped putting 10 pounds of sugar in their body. They stopped overeating red meat because they don't eat any. And there's a purge that occurs. And again, there's this huge uptick. Now their thighs don't touch so much. They can go run and jog and jump, things that they never could do. Maybe they got off the sofa for the very first time in 10 years. And so they go, this veganism stuff is the best. Vegetarianism itself is the best. But then, over time, they start losing the thickness of their skin. You ladies who have you see those ladies with the sunken eye sockets because they've lost all of the fat in their eyeballs because they don't eat it anymore. You never get that layer back, ladies. You can have it injected, but it'll just go right back into your bloodstream. Now there's a movement of anti-veganism. There's a channel that's dedicated to it on YouTube. Where a guy just interviews people. He doesn't even really ask any questions. He just puts them up there and says, tell your story, what you were. And you might think, well, these are dumb vegans who did it wrong. No. He has women up there that were married to men that were vegan specialists that went through like 5 extremely super disciplined versions of veganism. All their kids were constantly sick. And the second the mothers finally said, you know what, and you mothers, I love you guys, when you have children, there's just nothing more amazing than when a woman has a child and really takes it seriously, and she protects her child. And I'm not talking about the Munchausen by proxy, but they do a really good job, and they realize the food they're eating sucks. They start getting rid of like these super sugared cereals. They stop feeding their kids all this crap. But this woman got out of veganism and noticed all of her children got immediately healthy. Their scores in school went up. They went from being inside all the time and sick and just like, those poor kids that are just, they believe they're sick all the time, so they are. They went out and played, Imagine that. You've never played a game with other kids, and now you're not only playing, but you're one of the best players out there. You need healthy nutrition for your brain. If I was super duper starving to death, I can't do these episodes. I have no energy. My thought processes don't connect properly. But now, what is veganism? What is vegetarianism? It's a fucking trend. That's what it is. They'll say that people who eat red meat are very aggressive. Okay. It's called we're aware that we're being fucked 24/7. When you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you have so little nutrition in your body at any one point in time that you're docile, you're weak, you're complicit. When someone wants to pass a bunch of laws that take away all of your rights, okay, whatever, I guess that's good, The meat-eating people are sitting there going, what did you say? Am I about to kick your ass? Is that what's about to happen here? Because that's how this country of America was won, Sorry for the digression. But now let's look at trends from a different perspective of what if trends didn't occur? What ends up happening? We have examples of exactly how this happens. I think classical music is the one I reference the most. When classical music comes on, anywhere in the world, like the Masters, right? The one thing you don't hear very often, and I would say this is relegated to mature adults, is you usually don't hear people sit at a party or something with any level of intelligent people in the room, and they make fun of it. They don't sit around and tell you how Bach was a hack, or Mozart was just some punk-ass kid making music. You don't hear that often, do you? I once heard my Dr. Gray, my old teacher in drama, he once said, you never, ever, ever insult Shakespeare, a.k.a. probably Francis Bacon. Because to do so removes all doubt that you have no concept of what you're talking about. Now, I just grew up from the 70s up, right? So I can say that what if the 70s rock and roll continued for a really long time, say 100 years, and Led Zeppelin just kept getting better and better and better, and their records never ceased to sell. Well, they probably didn't anyway, but they didn't feel the need to put keyboards in their music because the 80s started doing that, right? Look at Van Halen. Van Halen is well known for starting out a rock and roll band and sort of ending up this silly synth band, with songs like Jump. What was it? Keyboards were in Motley Crue's music after a while because it just became a trend. And they moved into every single 80s rock band in the 80s and said, you got to put a keyboard in there. They're like, why? Because Pat Benatar is doing it. What? Yeah, it sells more music. We got to put keyboards in this thing, right? They're like, we don't want to put that crap in our music. We make hardcore, top fuel rock and roll. We don't want to put this crap in there. They came to these bands and said, you got to dress like girls. What do you mean? We just want to make, Led Zeppelin didn't dress up like girls. Why do we have to dress up like girls? Because that's the new thing. With Motley Crue, they kind of made a iteration of Kiss Paint. They were sort of like a tribal Native American devil-worshipping guys, right? Hurrah, hurrah. But how did the whole trend of the 80s glam metal end? It ended with Poison. Poison, who walked onto the set, was like, how much like a girl could you possibly make yourself look? From hair to full eye makeup to everything. Goofy little tracks. I mean, God bless them. You know, we have those, for those of us who grew up in those eras, some of those songs are part of our personal history, our own personal lives, right? But the nugget of what we remember is what we did with our lives, not necessarily the music that just happened to serenade the moment. But what if these trends hung on? How did we get this trend that everything falls apart? Because there was a change imposed on society. Why does a factory constantly clip the quality of what they do? But there's sort of two sides to it. For the layman's response, it's, well, to make the product cheaper, to increase their profits, to then reinforce their stock dividends, and they look good on Wall Street. Again, something that really is sort of an ancillary thing to making a good product. But the real technical side of manufacturing is to say, well, the machines that used to make this old thing, we had to retire them because we had to upgrade to the new thing. So these machines are really expensive to make. You know, Electrolux vacuum cleaner, right? At some point, a certain amount of suction is all you need to get this shit off your carpet, right? You don't need to innovate suction. But they do. They innovate the body of the unit. And of course, again, you know, you got your bagless vacuum cleaners now, thank God, right? But it doesn't have to happen as quickly as it does it? But let me give you a contrast in case you don't agree with that. Because the manufacturing assembly lines, the automation that makes it really, really profitable had to be rebuilt for everything, from blenders to everything. How car, assembly lines work. There are companies like Hostess, Oreo, Hershey, and they've been making the same thing. Again, we know that they've upgraded recently to a bunch of shitty ingredients because the goal is to poison the living crap out of all of our kids, right? But a lot of these candy makers can have the same exact assembly line for 40 to 80 years. Now, obviously, at some point, the machines, regardless of how great they are, will break down. And why not use modern technology to rebuild them? But those assembly lines were able to stay the same. And we didn't complain when the Oreo cookie tasted like it did back in the 70s, did we? In fact, any type of modification to these cookies or the chocolate, my God, the chocolate tastes like shit these days, but it used to be amazing. So at the same time, we will back up and reinforce the need for this reinvention of every single product that exists. We also like things that don't change at all. What if imagine Coca-Cola back in the 80s created new Coke, and God, it was awful. We didn't want it to change. We resisted. We said, get back the original recipe. Stop this idea that a trend went all the way down to the actual formula of Coca-Cola. You felt like you needed to do it. Now, of course, a lot of those are just scams, right? IHOP, the International House of Pancakes, changed its name to, IHOB, International House of Burgers or something, as a little gimmick. And everyone is now so relieved they're back to IHOP that they're now eating at IHOP. Boy, I can't believe they're going to do that thing. We showed them. Eat the pancake. Really hilarious, right? Brilliant. Those aren't necessarily trends. Those are little tricks they play on us to have some fun. But now what about pattern fatigue? Pattern fatigue is a gigantic element that is taught to mankind. And perhaps there's some biological reality to it, but I don't know. What is pattern fatigue? Well, would you like it if the Corvette stayed the same for 20 more years like they did in the 80s and 90s? I voiced my frustration that actually occurred in previous episodes, I think in season 1. I think the episode's called American Way. But it was frustrating to me. The car was reinvented. The prototypes went out in 83. You could buy it in 84, I believe. And it just stayed the same. I mean, yeah, a little headlight, tail light change here and there. But overall, the car was just an absolute bore 20 years later. And you know what's really strange about that is that people still buy 57 Chevys. They still buy 65 Cobras. We still buy the old cars. But now, isn't that an anomaly in our brains where we say everything has to be new and upgraded and changed? The Lexus has got to change. And yet people buy classic vehicles. We get tired of our old clothing. But now, how does it really affect us personally, right? In my experience, it goes like this. And you guys, you're going to laugh your ass off. Some of you guys are trend whores, so you'll get this from the other side of the game. But someone will, in your life, be a really trendy person. I mean, they've got to buy new clothes, new everything constantly, right? You know, the iPhone comes out, the new one comes out, and they literally get rid of the phone that's almost a year old. They got to get rid of it and get the new one. But if you have a boyfriend or girlfriend or a partner or a friend who is a trendy person, the virus spreads like a pathogen. They get in your life either with a new item or with sort of a passive criticism of what you have. If you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, they can really get up in your business, right? Oh, you still have that old thing. Oh, gosh, you need this new thing. Some people I've even heard, my God, I've heard people say, they wouldn't date their boyfriend or girlfriend. Or usually it's the boyfriend that gets the butt of the whole thing, but, he doesn't drive a fancy enough car to be attractive as a human being. Now, I know what most of you are saying who have principles and integrity, like, well, that person's a piece of shit. Don't date them. And you're not wrong, in my opinion. But isn't it sad that other than the trend that has infected their mind like a virus, perhaps they were a good person. But because they're impressionable, they're smart, and they're not intelligent, they don't think for themselves, they're going to be subject to this their whole life. Never being able to have a decent relationship with someone who has any level of integrity, any principle. They suffer peer pressure like crazy, and they're always persecuting those around them. They have all the latest items, but not a single lick of love, right? They have everything that's supposed to make you happy, but they're miserable because they have no social interaction. Every time an iPhone used to come on sale, it used to be that big line out front, right? I can pretty much tell you that you just go down that line, and those are a bunch of people that suffer from this condition. And believe me, Apple marketing understands that they have actually latched into the cheek with a big hook of marketing into all of their impressionable snowflakes, that this stuff is that important. Yes, you should pitch a tin in front of an Apple store, which doesn't happen anymore, for 2 days so you can be the first one to walk out with an iPhone, so you can be the big dick who walks around going, I got the new one, you don't, you just go down 2 days later and I got the same thing, dude. I didn't have to sit out like some doofball in front of a retail store. Trends are at the heart of worshiping stuff. Trends are at the heart of believing that stuff is going to make you happy. Now, there's some strategic resources in the world that if you get quality products, there's definitely truth to that. If you're a big commuter, you should probably have a really good car. If you have a big family, it's probably important that you have a house that can handle the load, right? So we're not demonizing owning quality products. If anything, get quality products, save up, spend more, and then keep that product for an extended period of time. But let me just mention it again. I just mentioned it in an episode, I can't remember which one, a couple back, that my most wealthy friends in the world who are really happy, you go to their normal houses. I mean, I have a couple friends that have, multi-million-dollar homes that even in LA you're like, damn, that's a nice house. But you go inside, and it's not stuff worshiping. They have quality products. I have one friend of mine, he's probably got furniture that spans 50 years. Barcelona chairs and wild leather sofas from the 70s that are just such high quality products that there's no need to replace them. It took them, probably 10 years into flat televisions to get rid of their CRTs. They don't worship stuff. They like stuff. They like to have nice stuff. But they don't get up in the morning and stretch and go, oh my God, I'm so glad I have that car in in the front, driveway. So why go on and on about the trend thing? Most of you would agree with me that money is probably the biggest control factor in the world. It controls our happiness to a degree. Now, again, you need a minimum amount of money just to simply keep the lights on and keep your house over your head and get from point A to point B. But beyond that, it's all just gravy, right? For those of you who acknowledge savings accounts, you'll understand without extra money at the end of the month, you simply can't save anything at all. Well, we're in the age of the microtransactions. Your cell phone is a huge negative force on all of your money, depending on how much you engage it, because it's $2 there, 99 cents there. Well, geez, I can afford 99 cents. I mean, think about how much I paid for my last coffee. $6 or something, right? I want you to control your brain. I want you to control what you're addicted to. Could you imagine if we were going for world peace in this planet, and you're like, well, we have a machine and it's only going to work one time, and we're going to push this button and everyone in the whole world is going to get one thought. It will never work again. In fact, it's this invention that an alien dropped off. God dropped it off. But now we have to sit around and philosophize at a table. What would that thought be? I got a jackhammer, a helicopter, and a fucking jet flying over my house. Jesus Christ. Where's the fucking ice cream man? He's late. I think one of the thoughts that we could put into man to really stop the entire world's insanity would be, don't let other people tell you what to think about anything. And think about it. It would neutralize religion. It would neutralize hatred. And consequently, I think it would neutralize the marketing strength of companies that are simply peddling products that you don't need. Now, the only catch-22 that comes with this whole trend thing is sort of in the area of growing up. Because you can have people that hang on to their adolescence for a really long time to their detriment because they can't engage, say, professionals in a company, which is required for them to continue to be employed. And so they seem immature. I have probably criticized at least once on the show and several times in my lifetime. When Facebook started, we got a lot of photographs from people from my hometown that hadn't changed their appearance since the 80s. And I mean the makeup, the high hair, the clothing, they look exactly like a time capsule that has simply aged a little bit from the 80s. And I reflect on that now, and I want to qualify my own personal thoughts to myself, which is to say, well, as long as they have matured over time and they're still a great person, they hung on to their principles, it doesn't really matter what they look like. They can continue to wear acid-wash jeans and have high hair and all that good stuff. I apologize for the jackhammer that just showed up in the middle of the show here. We have one of those situations where the street outside my house has a little coned off area where they're doing some work. But luckily, we're towards the end of our episode here. It's like MK Ultraing my mind. The beautiful thing about a deep thought is that it puts you directly in the epicenter of your own intelligence. And I just did the episode on fake intelligence, and so when you listen to someone else either disagree with you or take you on a journey of thought, no matter what it is, right? You're having your own sort of deflection and reflection on every single thing that I'm saying, right? You either agree with me or don't agree with me, but regardless, you're getting to know yourself a lot better in the process, which is the overall value, hopefully, of this particular show. I want you to have complete control over your mind. I don't want there to be a marketing firm out there that can tell you that you're obsolete. Now, again, if you're specifically a person that is in a career that has a lot of upgrading, right? You're a programmer, you're an engineer, you're going to need to stay up on trends of technology. It's just the way it is, right? So there are exceptions to this rule, but that's more of probably the positive side of the development of mankind, right? But the pattern fatigue that I was referencing earlier, where something looks outdated, is really silly. There's some of us that like tacos, and a taco simply has a shell, some meat, some cheese, some lettuce, and maybe some tomato with a little bit of salsa on top. And for the rest of my life, I don't need the taco reinvented. It was made perfectly, and I don't reinvent my taste buds over time, so the taco will always taste good to me. Now, if I eat 25 in a row, I will probably not eat them for a month, right? But what does Taco Bell try to do? Oh, we got a taco wrapped in some beans and some other thing, and da-da-da-da-da. They're reinventing the taco as if people are actually tired of a normal taco. The reality is, technically speaking, that Taco Bell has so replaced their meat with fillers and binders and bullshit and shrunk the size of the taco, and they don't actually have cheese that's actual milk, that it no longer tastes good. And so you think, oh God, tacos just taste crappy these days. Until you go off to a Miguel Jr.'s here in Southern California, you're like, aha, there's cheese, there's a real taco. Not everything has to be reinvented. As a good piece of artwork on the wall of your house, you don't get tired of it necessarily, right? Are people tired of the Mona Lisa? I'm not going to the Louvre. Why? That Mona Lisa, it's so old. I've seen that my whole life. I don't want to see it again. Hey, you may not need to see it in real life more than a couple times before you elect not to go through the pain of getting into the Louvre and navigating the tourism. But that has nothing to do with the Mona Lisa herself, right? In closing, I just want to say, this really doesn't have anything to do with you trying new things in life, of being adventurous. If anything, the less you adopt trends, your journey and your exploration of life will be more your invention and not some marketing firm's invention, right? Where do you go on holiday? Well, why don't you decide? If you have absolutely no idea, travel agents will definitely suggest a bunch of wonderful alternatives, but hopefully it goes, well, what do you like in the world? Well, I don't know. Well, have you ever been to the Bahamas? Well, no. Well, what's that have to do? Well, okay, do you like warm, sunny, clean beaches? Oh, yeah. I never really experienced that before, but that sounds fantastic. And they go, well, that's why you might like the Bahamas. But it's based on your review of the world. What you like becomes what people will be recommending to you and what you go off and spend your money and time doing. Hey, it doesn't mean you're going to win every single time, but at least you're trying based on what you like, right? I think you feel me. This jackhammer is not going to stop here. It'll stop the second I stop recording. If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. There's audio, video, a locked Facebook group, and a Patreon page. For those folks that are supporting me on Patreon, I thank you very, very much. For those guys and gals that watch me on YouTube and download the podcast, as always, super duper appreciate it. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in this next Jackhammer Day. Over and out.